But first, we're going to bring on our colleague, Omar Karmi, of the Electronic Intifada. Hi, Omar.
Hi there, Nora. Thanks for having me.
Hi, Omar.
Thanks for being
Hi,
here.
Adi.
So we wanted to have you on to talk about kind of political and regional developments. There's a lot going on with the UN Security Council resolution, and all sorts of diplomatic machinations. The U.S. once again putting the onus on Hamas, even though Hamas has said that it supports the resolution for a ceasefire. Can you talk about what you've been looking at and the failure of what the U.S. purports are its diplomatic efforts to achieve a ceasefire?
So the ceasefire proposal, which was accepted by the UN Security Council yesterday, is interesting for a number of reasons, but it might be useful if I just go through what it actually is. Yeah. So this is supposed to be a 3-phase ceasefire, where in the first phase there's a ceasefire, there would be a hostage exchange, the Israeli military would redeploy from populated areas of Gaza and allow the unfettered access of humanitarian aid. That is supposed to be a 6-week period before a second phase, which would lead to a permanent ceasefire, the withdrawal of Israeli military from every area of Gaza, and the final exchange of hostages, which would then lead to a third phase, which would be a multi-year, is what they put it. In fact, the UN has estimated that to rebuild Gaza could take as long as 80 years after all this destruction. Anyway, a multi-year reconstruction phase, international reconstruction phase. Now, what's interesting about the proposal, well, several things are interesting about the proposal, but first of all, there's no talk in there of a total victory, which is, of course, why everybody is really waiting, not so much for Hamas's response. Hamas has welcomed it. They have details to iron out, which is entirely natural. But everybody is really waiting for an official response from Israel. Now, the US has presented this as an Israeli proposal. It's very similar to the proposal early May, ahead of Israel's Rafah invasion, which Hamas also accepted, but about which Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, basically said, with or without a deal, we are still going for total victory. And of course, what happened was there was no deal. Israel invaded Rafah, despite US opposition to an invasion of Rafah, and has wreaked untold damage, as you saw in the report, ever since. In fact, Médecins Sans Frontières, that you quoted there, say that since the 1st of June, that is what, 12 days? 800 people have been killed in Gaza. So clearly, whatever efforts the US had, whatever thoughts they had about we're opposed to a Rafah invasion, it is clear that, as you said before, the US has set no red lines for Israel. Or if it has set red lines for Israel, Israel isn't listening, simply. So I think what's interesting about this ceasefire proposal is that it meets many of the core demands of Hamas: full withdrawal, exchange of prisoners, and of course a permanent ceasefire, which I think is important, and which is why, of course, Hamas have welcomed it. It needs a lot of details. The first phase is supposed to last 6 weeks. Crucially, and this is also important, the proposal stipulates that even if negotiations for a hostage exchange exceeds those 6 weeks, the ceasefire should continue. So that's also important. It is, in effect, a call for a permanent ceasefire.
But Omar, if I may, it's on that. I listened, for example, to the statements, media interviews with various members of the Hamas political bureau in recent days. And yesterday, actually, since the Security Council passed this resolution, for example, Osama Hamdan said exactly, in effect, what you say. We welcome these ideas. We responded positively. But for us, we won't accept any fudge about a permanent ceasefire, because it seems to be that for Hamas is they want it with no ambiguity, no negotiations about extending the ceasefire. The ceasefire is going to be permanent. But what I want to ask you about, it just seems so odd to me that Hamas has now come out and welcomed this proposal in one form or another on May 6th, when the Americans transmitted it to Hamas through the Qatari and Egyptian mediators, an American-approved proposal. And then again, following the Security Council resolution yesterday, they came out, they said, we welcome this. We've got a few comments, particularly this issue of the permanent ceasefire and end to this genocide. The Americans insist that this is an Israeli proposal and Israel has already accepted it. But the Israelis beg to differ. There has still been no statement from the Israeli Prime Minister saying, yes, this is our proposal and we accept it and we're committed to it. And on the contrary, there have been multiple statements from Israeli leaders saying, we will never agree to a permanent ceasefire, we'll never end the war, we disagree with this proposal. Antony Blinken was in Doha, Qatar today. He gave a press conference with the Qatari Prime Minister, where again he insisted, against everything we can all, see or hear or read, that he insisted that Israel accepts this and Hamas rejects it, when in fact the truth we can all see is the opposite. How do you explain this, Omar?
Well, I mean, it's hard to explain with any rational sort of logic, because U.S. diplomacy has been, well, I call it incompetent in one of my recent articles. I think that might be a fairly positive spin on it. But basically, this is what it is. U.S. diplomacy is entirely based on not looking to pressure Israel. Now, this whole selling it as an Israeli ceasefire proposal is very interesting, because actually, as I say, it is there are a number of points in there that Israel, up until, well, today, basically, just doesn't agree with. Israel has insisted from the beginning it wants what it calls total victory, which is a complete elimination of Hamas, and which obviously is impossible to achieve. So they've set themselves an impossible target, in part to set themselves up for a continuous war, continuous assault. And this is what they've done so far. There's nothing that has changed in the month that you talk about since the last ceasefire proposal to this one, diplomatically anyway, from the Israelis anyway, that would suggest that the Israelis would suddenly turn around and go, no, we don't want total victory now. We're happy where we got to, and this is where we can end it. So it is clear to me that this is not an Israeli ceasefire proposal. Or if it is an Israeli ceasefire proposal, it's from elements in Israel that don't seem to be represented by the government. Perhaps this has something to do with Gantz and Benny Gantz's resignation. Maybe this came from him. It may be that there is an attempt, basically, by the US to engineer some kind of a power shift in Israel. But it seems highly unlikely that this emanates from Israel. This is an American proposal, and it's the same, or pretty much the same proposal as it was last time. So the public spin that the US is giving it, which is to say that it's up to Hamas, the ball is in Hamas's court, all of this stuff, is basically the US trying to give itself a way out, and yet again, not blame Israel, which is, what the US diplomatic efforts seem to have been entirely focused on for the past 8 months, not to blame Israel.
In your op-ed piece that you wrote last week, which people should read, Rudderless, Incompetent, and Complicit, you talk about how Washington's, commitment to constantly moving its own goalposts is not a good look for a superpower, you say, because it makes it look feckless. Can you talk about moving the goalposts in terms of also the US's kind of speaking out of both sides of its mouth in terms of international legal obligations and international humanitarian rights law, in order to protect Israel, in order to create a narrative where Israel is absolutely abiding by international law, whereas the Palestinians are not, even though, time and time, the ICC and the ICJ have said that Israel's actions in Gaza constitute genocidal acts. Can you talk about the U.S.? Like, what does this mean in terms of the legitimacy of international law and international human rights law after this? What does it mean for any of it?
Well, I think, I think the incompetence part of this is very much U.S. diplomacy over these entire, because U.S. public diplomacy from December has been to urge Israel to calm down. We expect Israel to wind down its operation. We expect Israel to allow humanitarian aid. We don't accept a buffer zone in Gaza. We don't accept a Rafah invasion. I mean, constantly public diplomacy, American public diplomacy, has been to say certain things that Israel has almost immediately defied. So from public diplomacy perspective, it's been a complete failure from the Americans. And more than a failure, it's been an embarrassment. I mean, if you're a superpower, in March, just ahead of Ramadan, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, and the US abstained. Now, normally, this is a very serious signal, diplomatic signal, that this is what the US wants, particularly when it comes to Israel, where it normally vetoes. Totally ignored. Just last month, with the ceasefire that we were just talking, the former ceasefire proposal we were just talking about, the US was clear that Rafah was a red line. Well, it wasn't a red line, because immediately Israel went into Rafah. Then they tried to dissemble, and you heard Sullivan, who's on the picture there of the article, talk about, well, we believe it's still a limited operation, but we have conveyed our clear position, or the president's clear position, to Israel. And when he was asked about what that clear position was, he literally said, there's no mathematical formula. It depends on if there is a lot of death and destruction. Well, this came a day before Israel bombed a tent encampment in Rafah, killing 46 people. That clearly, this came a day after that, and that clearly didn't meet this non-mathematical formula for a lot of death and destruction. So basically, there are no red lines. But what the US is doing by coming up with these statements is it's looking impotent. It is looking as if it has lost control. Either it is telling Israel one thing behind closed doors and then saying something in public, but by doing, even if it's doing that, it's looking incompetent. It's looking powerless. It's looking weak. And for a superpower, for the US, which has maintained sort of overall hegemony in the Middle East for decades, it's a very poor look.
Well, Ahmad, let's talk more about that, because I think, I mean, speaking for myself personally, and I think many people across the region, the weaker the United States is in the region, the better. The sooner it gets out, the better. The United States has caused nothing but chaos and destruction for decades. We could talk about Iraq, Syria, Libya. Of course, it's decades of support for Israeli savagery and barbarism and occupation, apartheid. And now, of course, it's unlimited, no red lines support for genocide. The US, to put it bluntly, is a force of evil in the region. So the weaker, the better. That's how a lot of people see it. And I don't disagree with that at all. But of course, so I don't care if the US looks weak. I want the US to be weak. I don't care about the interests of you know, the genocidal psychopaths in Washington. But this weakness, this image of weakness or impotence, as you put it, does have consequences, in the sense that, you know, the main attraction of the United States for regimes in the region is that the US is a protector. The US is a guarantor of stability. Talk about that. You know, the weakening of the United States, both in terms of perception and in reality, and the increase in the influence and strength of China, the fact that China brings actual development and infrastructure and trade and diplomacy. What impact is that having even on the closest clients or vassals of the United States in the region? And how does that relate to what's happening in Palestine?
Well, so there's a lot in there, but I think the weakening of the US role in the region, particularly in general in the world, has been, you know, a gradual process which has been taking place. Much has to do with the rise of China as an economic power and as a trading, as a technological giant. But I think what has happened over the last 9 months is because of the incompetent handling of Israel. This process is accelerating and accelerating really quickly. I mean, I think the US has been aware that its role as you know, atop a unipolar world was coming to an end. Back in 2017, the Department of Defense released this very detailed report talking about warfare in the future and how the US had to readjust to a multipolar world. So, you know, this has been clearly been in the cards for a while. We know that China's economy is set to overtake America's anywhere between 5 and 30 years. Most people agree that that is an inevitability. But combined with diplomacy, Israel used to be seen as a projection of US strength in the Middle East. Today, with the way they've handled everything, in addition to, of course, the fact that what they're handling is a genocide. I mean, this is not merely about politics. This is an actual genocide, and people across the region are looking at this, and whatever their feelings might have been before or after, this is a genocide, and the US is supporting it, and it's clear as day. So in addition to sort of other economic and diplomatic and political factors, the fact that the US has stood so steadfastly by Israel while it's committing a genocide is accelerating a process of people saying, what are our options? And with the public diplomacy I was talking about, rather than looking as a projection of strength in the region, Israel is now looking as a projection of weakness, of US weakness in the region. If it's unable to hold Israel to international law, if it's prepared to set aside international law for its ally, but not only international law, even its own laws. I mean, the US has very strict rules for weapons exports, the Leahy law. And Israel has been allowed to breach these rules. Even Patrick Leahy himself wrote a piece in the Washington Post last month, I think, saying that at least some Israeli military units are in breach of that law and should be sanctioned. So, having failed to get its ally in line, even though it's been saying that it wanted, like I said before, it has on numerous occasions said a number of things that it wanted Israel to do, and Israel has completely ignored it. So it's looking weak. And as a result of that, countries of the region are looking elsewhere. They were already looking elsewhere. I mean, China is the biggest trading partner of both Saudi Arabia and Iran, interestingly. In fact, China brokered the re-establishment of diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran in 2020. It has invested more than $120 billion in Iraq, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And the UAE is really interesting in this respect, because the UAE, which signed this Abraham Accord, normalizing relations with Israel. There are many reasons why the UAE did this, but one of the things that it was promised as a result of this accord was the delivery of F-35 fighter jets from the US. Now we are 4 years down the line, maybe 5 years down the line. Those jets have not been forthcoming, and the UAE are now sourcing their military hardware from China. So when you put your eggs in a basket of a superpower, and let's not forget the Iran deal. I mean, the Iran deal was brokered by one administration and torn up by the next. So if you have an administration that presents itself as a force for good, a force for stability, a force for development, and yet you cannot rely on it to stick to its agreements, and you cannot rely on it to stick to its own laws, let alone international law, then the natural reaction will be to turn elsewhere. And for many decades, there was no elsewhere to turn to for the countries of the region. But that's changed. There's China. So China is really growing in its influence, frankly, merely by the fact of not being the US. I mean, it doesn't really have to do much, but it is doing more as well. It's even hosted Palestinian unity talks recently in May, which unsurprisingly have not led anywhere yet, but China is playing a bigger and a bigger role. And I think what we're seeing now with this quite irrational and immoral support for genocide in Palestine is the beginning of the end of American dominance in the Middle East.
So, Omar, one other thing on that. I mean, one of the Biden administration still keeps talking about a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal as a way, sort of as a prize that's going to get Israel, that it's going to win for Israel if Israel agrees to this proposal, whatever it is, and that's going to be the path for, stability, prosperity, and apple pie across the region. I mean, and at certain moments, it's appeared, at least, in terms of the media spin, that normalization deal is on the verge of happening. And that was supposed to be sort of the cherry on the cake of the Abraham Accords, where Israel normalized with the UAE, the Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and a couple of, I can't remember them all, the sort of smaller client states. Is it going to happen? And is it of any value either to Israel or the Saudis, or are these just delusions in Washington or media spin?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I would say that before October 7, it was in the cards. I mean, it still seemed to me that I didn't quite understand what was in it for Saudi Arabia. I mean, don't forget, Saudi Arabia came up with a 2003 Arab Peace Initiative, 2002 maybe, which was basically offering Israel complete normalization and peace with the entire Arab world in return for a Palestinian state, 67 borders, and just a resolution to the refugee issue. That has been completely ignored, right? And so for Saudi Arabia to sign on to a normalization deal with Israel without any of this happening was always going to be a big ask. Now, since, of course, Israel began its genocide in Gaza, this has been even more unlikely. And while there have been two attempts, one by Blinken, one by Sullivan, and both those attempts, this in the last 2 months, to reestablish this deal, both those attempts were followed by sort of headlines that seemed to suggest that a deal was incredibly close. In fact, I'd suggest the deal is further away than ever, because and for the same reason that US diplomacy is foundering elsewhere. The Saudis want what they wanted in the Arab Peace Initiative, which is a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. The Israelis are completely opposed and unwilling or unable to push Israel to do anything. The US has had to drop it. And that is central. And now, of course, Saudi Arabia doesn't need the US. One of the aims of this deal was precisely to steer Saudi Arabia away from China. I mean, that's been openly admitted. And there seems to be no reason for Saudi Arabia to want to be steered away from China, its biggest trading partner at this moment in time, for absolutely no gain, other than military hardware, of course, and AI technology, I believe.
Right.
All of which are now readily available from other
Absolutely.
sources.
Right.
And by the way, when you say that the Chinese economy is set to overtake the US, by some estimates I've read, it's already overtaken the US in terms of purchasing power, and by other indicators, just a few years ago, basic, fundamental research and technology was far higher in the United States, and now that's shifted. Basic scientific and technological research and innovation is now taking off in China. So the engines of Chinese development and growth are just, off the charts. And so I think I agree with one thing you say, Omar, which is that all this is happening at an accelerated pace, and it's sort of hard to grasp it all fully.
Absolutely. And I mean, look, beyond the regional politics, what credibility does Washington have anymore if it goes to lecture other people, particularly Saudi Arabia? Let's not forget that the Biden administration wanted to treat Saudi Arabia as a rogue state for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And who's going to listen to Washington talk about human rights now after its wholesale support for what Israel has been doing? I mean,
yeah.
So this is the incompetence part. I mean, the US has just put itself in a situation where it just has no credibility.
And I don't want to let Europe off the hook. So, Omar, as someone in the adjacent belly of the beast in the UK, what does it mean for European politics and kind of and Western hegemony, as Ali was talking about, in general, in terms of the loss of whatever assumed credibility. That the West, Europe, and North America have enjoyed for so long, in how that credibility is tanking everywhere.
Well, I mean, I think everybody suffers from this problem. I mean, this sort of I don't want to say blind. I'm not, this devotion to Israel that the West seems to have, which transgresses law or rationality or anything, is clearly exacting a very steep cost for European and American diplomacy, Western diplomacy in general, and credibility. Europe will be as much a victim, perhaps less so. I mean, it might be seen as slightly less complicit, only because it's not such a big, they don't, fund Israel to the tune of 3.8 billion every year. So, you know, it might have slightly less of an impact, but a lot of countries in Europe, the UK, I just wrote a piece about Denmark where I had a foreign minister who basically said that even if you know, charges of war crimes are substantial against Israel, they'll still continue selling arms. I mean, these are countries who are openly rejecting international law that they themselves are so keen to impose on others.
Right.
So it will have a similar, maybe slightly less. I mean, Europe's role in the region remains mostly on trade rather than military, and that might save it a little bit more than the US. But yes, it's going to have an impact everywhere. I can't see any other outcome of this.
Yeah. Well, we just have a few minutes left. Ali, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I think that I'd like to ask Omar about this is something Omar's written about quite a lot, and maybe it's something we need to come back for a longer discussion since we only have a short time now. But Palestinian politics, you know, there's been this so-called split. You mentioned China hosting talks, and you said it's no surprise that they haven't reached any reconciliation between Hamas on the one hand, for example, and Fatah, the faction led by Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas. It's no surprise to me either, because on the one hand, Fatah is fighting this existential war, leading the resistance against a genocidal regime, while Mahmoud Abbas is sitting in Ramallah under the protection of Israeli occupation forces and totally dependent on financial transfers from the occupation to keep his authority going. And that's been the dynamic for a number of years since Hamas won the Palestinian legislative elections in 2006. But I just want to ask you about that, because Abbas and the PA still seem to be the darlings of the West, of the United States, the European Union, the great hope. And what is never discussed is sort of how Palestinians view the PA. And so I want to ask you about that. Does the PA have any relevance or any future, or is it on its last legs?
Well, it has relevance in the sense that, you know, it keeps a very large security force in the West Bank, which acts, as we've seen in the past, with great brutality against its own people. So from that perspective, it has relevance. It's also one of the biggest, if not the biggest employer in the West Bank. And that is, of course, very important in an occupied territory that doesn't have the ability to develop its own economy because of the occupation. In terms of credibility with its own people, it has barely any. I mean, I think the last opinion poll I saw, Abbas would have lost to any and all candidates, plausible candidates that he might have gone against, even from his own party. He has his approval ratings have hovered in the single figures up to the low teens for years, and because, you know, in the West Bank, it is clear to people that his strategy, if you can call it that, which is of total obedience to international dictates, complete cooperation with Israel, what's it got? It's got more settlements, more violence, more arrests, less and less space for Palestinians. I mean, long before last year, I went to Palestine myself, and I wrote a long feature about the situation there. And all the talk, and this is in April 2023, all the talk then was of genocide, of a slow genocide, of the slow squeezing of Palestinians off their land, of making an economy impossible. I mean, it has been clear for decades that what Israel wants is to rid themselves as much as possible of the Palestinian population, take the entire territory of Palestine, and be done with it. Smotrich's plan, is precisely that. Get us rid of as many people as you can, and the rest would have to accept second-class status. And that's what's been happening in the West Bank under Abbas. And as such, he has no credibility. And as such, the gap between him and Hamas, that stream of thinking, and Hamas has only widened over the years, because you can't have a compromise between we have to do everything we're told and no, we have to fight. There's no in between there. So one would have hoped that at a time of genocide against the Palestinian people, that if nothing else but shame would have intervened to bring the sides together in the overriding interests of the Palestinian people. And it is in the overriding interests of the Palestinian people right now to have some kind of a unified leadership that represents everybody in order to move forward. It is absolutely crucial, and the fact that it isn't happening is appalling, and it shows the level to which Palestinian politics has sadly descended.
Nora, do I have time for one more quick thing?
Absolutely.
I just want to let people know that in addition to being a brilliant analyst and writer, Omar is one of our editors who works very closely with our writers in Gaza. Many of the features and first-person accounts that you read from Gaza, Omar edits working directly with our writers in Gaza. And so, Omar, I just wanted to ask you very quickly to say a few words about our writers in Gaza and what it's like working with them under these circumstances.
Well, I mean, they've been amazing. They've been incredible, incredibly courageous, and I think what they have provided us with their first-person testimonies, with their reporting from Gaza, is a unique record of genocide, which I don't think I can't think of a parallel. Obviously, it's been heart-wrenching in many times. The stories we read, the stories they tell us are just appalling, and the suffering and the indignity that they have to suffer, and they are suffering, is simply incredible. And yet to still find it within them to write and to want to engage, want to show the rest of the world what they're going through is just it's incredible, and I think we should all be very grateful to them.
Yeah, and it's a true honor to be able to work with these incredible writers, reporters, people who shouldn't be reporting on what they're reporting. They should be living their lives as free and liberated people in all their dignity. And yeah, it just continues to be unbearable, but we're so honored to be able to work with our contributors. And we're honored to work with you every day, Omar. You are an associate editor and our colleague at the Electronic Intifada. Read Omar's latest analysis. I mentioned it at the top. It's called Rudderless, Incompetent, and Complicit. You wrote it on June 1st, which seems like a million years ago already, but it is absolutely still very, very, very newsy. And
there's a great a great piece, I think, just from yesterday,
right,
about Denmark.
On Denmark, yeah, right. The social democracy of Denmark, engaging with joy to encourage and be complicit in this genocide. So, thank you so much, Omar, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Omar.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.